electricity industry is, I think, unique amongst global trillion-dollar sectors. What other technologies can be deployed that help lower costs?
So what's changed this year so far?
Definitely there's more appetite than ever before. Provide electricity to everyone at the highest reliability at the lowest possible cost.
Is there a culture at all of innovation there or of technological change there that could help solve that problem?
We in the United States severely underinvested in our bulk transmission system.
I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and this is Power Perspectives. For any of you who have spent time on Twitter, I'm sure today's guest needs no introduction. Surely you have already seen graphics and stats from his very popular 200-slide annual presentations on the state of decarbonization. But just in case, Nat Bullard has spent nearly 20 years working on climate technology strategy and capital markets, and where they all overlap. He logged 15 years with Bloomberg NEF, authoring his popular Sparklines column, while he's a climate-focused keynote speaker, board-level strategy facilitator, consultant, advisor, and founder. He's mostly focused on how businesses approach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And that's what we're talking about today, the realities of decarbonization for energy businesses. If wind, solar, and storage are the cheapest forms of energy today, and we're teetering on the edge of a generational supply shortfall with the rise of AI and electrification, doesn't decarbonized energy make the most sense, purely economically speaking? And if so, how come we're still hemming and hawing and restoring coal and LNG-ing? In today's conversation, we'll get an answer. Several answers, I'm guessing. Now, we're talking about all of this with the foremost expert in the subject, so I will let him do most of the talking. Nat, welcome to Power Perspectives. I want to start here with an introduction to you. So if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about yourself, specifically what you do and why you do it.
My pleasure, Kinsey. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So, by way of introduction, my name is Nat Bullard. I'm a longtime analyst in the energy sector. I got my start now almost 20 years ago, covering what at the time was a very small and fairly limited market of U.S., what at the time you would call clean tech companies and initiatives. So that would be things like wind, solar, first generation bioenergy, to a lesser extent, carbon markets. I was part of a small startup founded in the UK. I joined the US team, which was then subsequently, after a few years, acquired by Bloomberg LP, at which point I spent an additional more than a decade within Bloomberg as part of the group that was then called Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and then eventually BNEF, covering these markets at global scale and all over the world. So I worked for Bloomberg in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C., and in Hong Kong. Left to go out on my own a couple of years ago. I then subsequently founded a company a couple of years ago called Halcyon. It's an AI-enabled search and software platform specifically looking at the unstructured data within the world of energy, and at the moment specifically electricity. And at the moment, I'm also based in Singapore. So I've managed to keep in the energy world for the last 2 decades, and I've managed to keep it global at that same time.
And it's a global industry, right? This is the everything we cover in our daily newsletter and everything at Energy Central. We realize that this is all an international space. It's something that impacts all of us, impacts every sector of the economy. So today we're going to talk about some of those big picture conversations about decarbonization, the technology, the financial landscape, a little bit of the business use case too, specifically for our audience of utility listeners. So I want to start by setting the scene. How are today's energy companies, from electric utilities to the O&G majors, how are they thinking about decarbonization? Kind of like what are the vibes like out there right now?
So, I'll back it up and start with how are they thinking about demand, which I think is the more fundamental question for then considering any kind of strategy within the mix that you have. And something that's been very interesting in my time looking at these two sectors is how they are rarely aligned in terms of their sort of long-term outlook, even necessarily to their sort of short to mid-term understanding of what market dynamics are like. So give me a little bit of rope here to lay this one out. But when I started doing this in 2007, you had You had the run up in global oil prices that eventually peaked in 2008 before collapsing back by more than $100 a barrel. At the same time, you had in the United States the peak in demand for electricity coming up, and in a power sector that was largely driven by coal and then by natural gas. What you've had subsequently to that was periods of rising demand for road transport fuels, not necessarily in the U.S. but globally, and a U.S. trend around electricity that was basically flat demand year on year for more than a decade. You had in the US a lot of production of new resources of oil and gas, and with it, this incredible change in the US from being a net energy importer to one of the world's significant exporters and a net exporter of energy, while the power sector was sort of displacing a huge amount of coal fired power with natural gas and at the same time introducing new renewable energy as a power source, but in a flat market. Let's fast forward all the way to where we are today. The electricity sector is in a multi decade high growth rate expectation. We have not had growth rates this high in the electricity sector in my career, and depending on how many of your professionals listening think about it, maybe not even in their lifetimes. Whereas demand for road transport fuel in particular is relatively cool in the United States. And globally, demand for oil is still growing, but with a relatively tiny increment year on year and with very specific market growth. So it's not necessarily growing so much in the US. It's certainly not growing in Europe. You could say across the OECD, it's not really growing. Most of the underpinnings of demand for liquids has been in the world's developing countries. Whereas power demand has been growing everywhere, but is now coming back with a vengeance in places like the United States in particular, as part of a kind of larger trend of first demand from new sources, such as in particular AI, but also new imperatives such as electrification of transport, electrification of industry, and so we have this with this complex sort of market where decarbonization, if we want to think about it, means different things to different people. Is it an imperative? Is it a strategy? Is it something that is a business as usual and part of what's actually happening? I think it really depends on where you want to look at one of these markets. If a market is not growing, say US electricity in the 2010s, and you are introducing new zero carbon generation sources, it is sort of decarbonization by default. If you are a place where the demand is growing and you have a multitude of possible fuel choices and energy choices to actually meet that demand, then it becomes a big question of strategy. I realize it's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's also because it's kind of a complex question, and more so today than it would have been, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago in 2021 or 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the context because you're right. It is far more complex today than it used to be. And that's part of why, we wanted to have this conversation with you today as well. I'm curious to hear, when you phrase this specifically about imperatives versus strategy. And I think that's a really interesting way to put it when we're thinking specifically about the US market, US electricity and energy. A lot of our audience is in North America. I would love to hear your perspective on how that paradigm, that kind of difference in calculus between the strategy and the imperative and what you have to do and what's good business. I would love to hear a little bit more about how that might have changed or shifted since January, right? Obviously, since 2021, it's different. But in this new administration, in Trump 2.0, how does that change when we see news constantly about the Trump DOE, stopping work on offshore wind projects, gutting renewable tax credits, keeping coal plants online past their planned retirements. With all of that, also electricity costs are rising. I would love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on just what's changed this year so far.
This is a great topic because the electricity industry is, I think, unique amongst global trillion-dollar sectors in that it has an imperative generally written into law, which is to provide service to everyone, to do so in a highly regulated context, often by writ in terms of being allowed to be a regulated monopoly provider in certain places, and to do so at the lowest cost and with the highest reliability and with the most, in the neutral sense of the term, equity, providing service to basically everyone. Road transport fuel businesses are not set up that way. Telecoms are not even necessarily set up the way that they are highly regulated. And the result is that like the imperative is always there. Provide electricity to everyone at the highest reliability at the lowest possible cost. And then you can add into that with other layers that can be determined at a sort of societal regulatory level. Uh, is it supposed to be low carbon? Is it supposed to be highly distributed? Is it supposed to be this sort of technology mix? And so the one thing that I think is important for everyone, and all of your practitioner audience knows this, is that providing electricity has not changed. The need to meet this demand has not changed. And so in one sense, the imperative has. And the question is how much are current policies unwinding the impositions in there? And I use that in a neutral term, the things that we put in as far as it needs to have this kind of distribution or it needs to be these types of resources in favor of what you might call a sort of incumbent way of viewing this, let's say a pre 2005 version of what the system is going to be. But then, how does unwinding what has been said already, what has been determined already, going to make the system work better? So, does canceling an almost completed offshore wind project that was going to energize 350,000 homes without fuel, does that somehow make our system more reliable or lower cost? I don't think that there's really honestly much debate about that in terms of what it means for ratepayers. Does creating one notion of reliability that's driven largely by spinning reserves and system inertia lower costs for ratepayers? I think very debatable to say the least. Does creating a system where you solve the challenge of high demand with an even higher amount of supply prove to be an effective way to limit cost impacts, at least on the generation side of power? I think the answer to that is very clearly yes. You can see that in the data in Texas and how few instances of cap prices we've had in the market this year compared to the last couple of years, while total system demand has continued to go up. And then the final question is what gets built, I think, fastest and most durably in order to meet the needs of a growing system? My colleagues and I at Halcyon have been doing plenty of work looking at the landscape for gas turbines. Nice work if you can get it, let's put it that way. We will soon have a white paper out that shows how the pricing paradigm has blown out completely. And I think everyone in the market is well aware of that. But I don't think a lot of people in policy and planning necessarily have sort of embodied the notion that things are scarce, they're expensive, there's no immediate term fix to come in and magically provide 25 to 50 gigawatts of new gas turbines a year for the United States to meet its demand. And so what's going to serve to meet growing demand in that case? To add one last wrinkle to it, what other technologies can be deployed that help lower cost? Is that going to be energy efficiency? Is that going to be home batteries that shift load? Is that going to be vehicle to home charging? There's a pretty rich landscape of possible options here that I think are better developed and better evolved than they were even a few years ago, but that are also made more complicated by policy impositions, as they always are. And complication can be good, complication can be bad. But I would say that right now, I think we're seeing a system where you have inflationary pressures that in many cases have little to do with the power generation side of things and everything to do with decisions that have already been approved, capital plans that have already been enacted, fuel price expectations that have already been priced. But that nonetheless, we have only a couple of tools left to sort of combat. One of them is the price of wholesale power.
To me, there is a bit of a disconnect as I do my best to really understand this industry and understand the motives and incentives for utilities, which to your point are very specifically operated businesses. They operate like nothing else in the US economy. When we hear things like we just need more power, right? Like there is a demand problem, and to your other point, supply will help solve this. We need more power and we need to be more efficient with the power that we have. Wind, solar, and storage are some of the cheapest options to get new power to where it needs to be, right? I think where sometimes can't really get from point A to point B is not understanding why are we not just running head first toward that, right? Like, I think that's kind of the question that I often have when it comes to understanding this, this case for decarbonization for utilities. When they're looking at their power mix, why not the cheaper things that are
Mhm.
also lower carbon is kind of the question that I keep running into, and often not necessarily coming to a satisfying answer. So I'm curious what you think.
There are answers, and I will tell you, I don't think the answers are going to be satisfying to anybody in the sense that a lot of times the rate determining step here is not the equipment for renewables. It's not the capital to finance the assets. It's not demand for the electrons. It's the ability to get things connected to the grid. We in the United States severely underinvested in our bulk transmission system. I mean, to the point that we build like five subdivisions of road distance worth of high voltage transmission every year in the United States, like several hundred miles max in 2024, which is a disappointing figure and essentially a rate limiter on building anything new. We have a slow process. We have a very procedural process, is a polite way to say it. We have a very litigious process on both sides of the aisle politically. And the net result is that it's not so much that you have bottled up supply that's waiting to go. No one is going to build the supply without the ability to transmit and then distribute that energy. And so I think without the ability to build that aspect of the grid, you're immediately sort of forestalling the ability to reach a much bigger market with potential power that's there. There's a very, very large, like comically big volume of potential power assets, almost all entirely renewable in the United States, that in theory is looking for a grid connection and looking for transmission. It's close to about 2 terawatts of power. That's more than the entire peak demand. Installed capacity in the US, much more than the peak demand in the US right now. But the determining step on it is not necessarily the ability to procure a solar module, but rather to get the interconnection to make it happen. So as I said, I don't think that's a particularly satisfying answer. And I would hope that it's not a satisfying answer because it implies within it a technical solution that can be implemented if you have sufficient speed and scale to do so, but that also indicates the bottlenecks within it, which have to do primarily with policy, planning, litigation, procedural approaches that make things necessarily slower than they could be. And to come back around to my earlier point, the challenge there is that these things were less apparent and less evident at a time when demand was not growing. They were less apparent and less evident and less of an issue when there was basically no growth in net electricity demand in the United States for close to a decade. They are very evident right now. And a challenge that we did not have to face in other periods of fast rising demand in the past. We had a greater, I think, societal capacity and appetite to build. And so without having that again right now, we're bottled up in a lot of ways in terms of building the new capacity that can meet demand.
You're right in that it's not necessarily the most satisfying answer, but it does tee up the next question, which is, it's satisfying in its own way. The culture of innovation and that idea of speed and scale that you mentioned are not necessarily particularly prevalent in the utility space by nature of the way that these businesses are set up. It's not a high risk, high reward industry. It's mitigate risk. It's keep prices low. It's, move very methodically, do not move fast and break things. What is the approach to technological innovation when we know that we have this power that could be connected to the grid, but there is just a stop here that we can't seem to get around? Is there a culture at all of innovation there or of technological change there, that could help solve that problem?
So, as the saying goes, the cure for high prices is high prices. There's no better market signal to do things differently and to try new things than having high prices. And upstream of the utility decision making is going to be the regulatory decision making to say yes, we would like to see some innovative approaches. We would like to support more battery energy storage to the grid, which will help shave peak pricing incidences everywhere. It's encouraging flexibility, encouraging demand response, and things like that. So I will say, having spent the better part of 2 decades around the kinds of people that found companies in this space, is that there is an absolutely ferocious appetite on the part of inventors and innovators to do new things. Again, so this I'm coming back around as I keep doing to the fact that when demand is now growing so rapidly, there's a much greater appetite to try new things within that regulated context of maintaining affordability and reliability. But it's very different to be proposing something that will make the system more efficient, lower latency, more renewable, and lower cost when the system is one where demand is increasing, where costs are increasing, and where reliability, depending on where you are, is in a less than perfect position, and therefore there's more appetite to do all of these things that are new. The big unlock there is to say how fast can these get? How fast can these get through the very complex multi-step process of getting approved as something that can be deployed? But definitely, there's more appetite than ever before, and it kind of resonates outward in a good way from the sort of the imperatives with which utilities have been tasked from the very beginning. But it does require a change of mentality, that it's not just building big plants to make sure that you meet that those peak 20 hours out of the entire year at a system level. It's also saying, how can I meet that same need through a different mechanism? And what role does innovation play in doing that? And fortunately, there are so many people that are working on this kind of thing, and there are so many people that are doing it in an inventive way that in a very helpful sense would not have necessarily been outright anticipated. And technology itself becomes an unlock, like a world in which you've got abundant grid scale batteries that you can deploy very fast. Is not the world in which I came up and started working. A world in which solar power is in sufficient supply to meet a net zero scenario to 2050 already is not a world that I had come to anticipate. And I think a lot of people in the sector are A, learning to embrace it, but then B, for others, this is just the native state. This is the market that they now know, and it is the expectation of what the market will be in the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I I tend to put my faith in those people who are smarter than I am, who are solving a lot of these big problems, those innovators, those future oriented technological thinkers. That is where I see so much promise. So in a world, let's hypothesize a bit, in a world where we do have people who solve some of these transmission problems, where technology does continue to increase and improve at a really impressive pace. I would love to bring it back to that decarbonization angle that we talked about. What does the generation mix look like if we solve this transmission problem from what you understand of the industry today? Does it look different from where we are right now in this high demand situation if demand continues to increase, but we have the transmission problem at least a little bit more solved? What's decarbonization like at that point?
If you were to magically solve the transmission bottlenecks in the
Yeah.
US
Wave
and
the wand.
create, yeah, first, and let's act like economists here. First, assume that this bottleneck that is very real does not exist. And secondly, assume other stability within the policy network, that the financial constructs, I will say it, under which these things exist, the tax regimes, the depreciation regimes, are stable enough to make a long-term asset plan. Then you would find, I think, that the majority of all new demand would be met with renewable sources because they're inexpensive, they're fast moving, the systems are increasingly able to understand, anticipate, react to, and integrate them. And the supporting technologies within the grids themselves are coming along. Not just storage, but other things like dynamic line rating are coming along to make these more attractive, more reliable. That would be the world that we would be in, right? You would have the lowest cost generation in bulk. You would have transmission over distance. You would have a large amount of energy storage to make sure that you're accounting for variability and to help shape the demand curve. And then you would have all kinds of other things, all kinds of other innovations within the distribution network that would be there in terms of how you shift demand, how you program your demand, how you think about large loads that are now generally envisioned as inflexible to become more flexible. All of these things would be there. And the thing is, as you can tell, each of these individual elements is essentially possible on its own. But you would, if you want to go the magic scenario, you would need to have all of them be true at once. You would need to have all of them be true and also be durable at once.
Mm. I think it kind of brings up this interesting conversation we've been having on the team about traditionally non-energy companies becoming energy companies.
Hmm.
If Google or Alphabet were to buy a utility, or they bring their own power to the grid, these kinds of companies that have a culture of innovation, so to speak, it, I guess, introduces a sort of interesting possibility that all of those incredible intelligent utility style technologies that you mentioned might be able to scale faster, might be able to pace faster on a grid that looks different from what we have today. And I'm curious how you think some of these, quote unquote, non-energy companies are approaching this problem.
Hmm.
Are they thinking about energy? Is this something that is front of mind for them?
So it's a good question to explore because we should step back a little bit. When Alcoa or U.S. Steel built an on-site power plant, or when the Linden refining complex in New Jersey built a combined heat and power plant, did that make them an energy company? Debatable, right? Does meeting one's own demand make them into an energy company? Does becoming a very big buyer of electricity make you into an energy company? Famously, one of the very first corporations was a non-power company to be registered in the power market as a power market entity was Walmart. Does that make Walmart into a power company? So the question I think is potentially yes, in the sense that you have these companies that are uniquely positioned now. I would say, in particular, the hyperscalers are, I think, uniquely positioned in history as both an enormous buyer of electricity specifically. They don't buy a lot of steam heat, and also one that has a great deal of ability to innovate in terms of the business model through which it buys power. That also has generally had an imperative to buy clean power, and that also has got relatively less, although in energy is an integral part of its expense base, it has relatively less sensitivity to the cost of electricity than, say, running a steel mini mill, or making aluminum, for which a small incremental change in the cost of power has a non-incremental change in the cost of the delivered good and product that you're making.
Mhm.
So, like, we are in a world where these companies they're all, if not an energy company, then they're at least an electricity company. But also in a place where we can have some sort of healthy reimagination of what that means. It doesn't just mean buying and selling power. It means providing your demand in the future as a service, in the sense that your demand is flexible. You're able to be a good citizen on the grid, as opposed to just be that one asset that is going to be the marginal unit that requires another marginal unit of power generation to come online on the world's hottest day in the mid-Atlantic. So, it requires a reimagination that I think all of these companies are really undergoing already. And then it requires counterparty flexibility as well. Is a utility going to be interested in doing this? I will say, and I read absolutely buckets of these things. If you read the dockets, if you read the proceedings from both the grid operators, the ISOs and RTOs, and from utilities themselves, there is every reason and every incentive to get this right, to understand a more flexible and more reliable system that includes your biggest consumers of electricity and your, by far, the quantum on the margin of growth and demand, as not just buyers, but also as actors, essentially as somebody who can both buy and sell, and be viewed as an asset and attribute to the grid.
It's compelling to think about what that grid looks like. So much of the work that we do is, what might 2030 look like, what might 2050 look like, and to think now that we're on the cusp of what this actually is going to be, and we're going to find out in real
2030 is
time.
not that
Is
far away. 2030 is not that
It's
far away,
not.
Kenzie. And in fact, if you think
No.
about it, it's basically within one business planning cycle. Right?
Great.
It's the things that we're talking about right now. Many of them will only be implemented in 2030. Like, even in the world's most aggressive timeline, for instance, for building nuclear generation capacity, maybe that would happen before the end of the decade. But even that is, like, incredibly accelerated compared to the historical timelines.
Yeah, 30 years away, right? Always. I think as we finish up this conversation today, I'm curious to hear your perspective on how we separate some of this, noise from signal. In your annual decarbonization presentation from earlier this year, I'm about to quote you to you. You wrote,
Thank
"We
you.
are in an exceptionally noisy moment, but also in a moment where the signals amidst the noise are very important and potentially foundational." So, as you mentioned, going through dockets and dockets of filings and information, and this person said, or this, our TO said this, and all of that. What do you think is signal and what do you think is noise when we're talking about the future of decarbonization in the broader electricity landscape? Do you have any specific signals or noise that come to mind that might be helpful for the people listening to this episode?
So I'm not entirely a technological determinist. Like technology is not the thing that makes everything happen. In particular, by virtue of the system we've designed that is meant to be highly regulated for all the reasons we already discussed. But I also think that technology on the longer run tends to win. The things that have a technology based cost curve behind them, a technology based way of thinking about deployment, how it can move in increments and at what volume and at what speed, uh, tends to have a way of dominating systems over time. And so the signal that I'm always looking for is, total capital that's been deployed. Generally, that's better as a global measure than it is in the very, policy oriented US. But also, like, what cost for equipment do we see? Where can we look ahead into corporate plans and into sort of innovation roadmaps and have a sense for what the future might be? That's a case where technology, I think, has an advantage over pure fuels in a way. Is that we don't necessarily have a cost curve for changing the thermal energy input of coal or thermal energy output of coal, rather, or of oil. These are more or less molecularly fixed. But we do have an ability to think about taking this fundamental material as an input, transforming it into a product that then either makes or stores power at costs that are lower than they would have been a couple of years ago, and that are also higher right now than they will be in the future. And I tend to think that technology in this sense has a way of winning out. And in fact, you can see it in a market in particular like Texas, where when less encumbered by a lot of market impositions, you see the bulk of what people are building being mostly solar and mostly batteries, because that's those are the things that are going to win. Places where that's a bigger question would be like in the world of transportation, for instance. Uh, I live in Southeast Asia, and in fact, the city state that I live in has gone from very few pure EVs 5 years ago to now being almost mostly EVs and plug-in hybrids in terms of total sales of vehicles, and in which one Chinese car company went from 1/10% of total supply to being the second largest supplier of new automobiles in the course of 4 years. There's a lot of rapid movement that's happening. This is my last quick global pitch here. A lot of rapid movement that's happening in other places that does not require the permission framework of the United States. And the question for us will be, do we remain walled off from that or ring fenced from that forever? And the answer to that is, I do not know.
And I do not either, but I hope to find out.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah. It's wonderful to get this perspective from you, Nat. And I think that the putting all of this into context for our listeners is incredibly important. The idea that the arc of history in the energy space will bend toward what makes sense economically is something that I hope we can hang our hats on, and as I'm sure we'll end just about every conversation that we have on this show. We'll see. We'll see what happens in 2030. We'll see what happens in 2050. But before I let you go, Nat, I would love to do a quick lightning round with you. These are super rapid fire questions to finish this up here today. So to start, what is the best part about your job in just a handful of words?
Being challenged every day.
I dig it. I agree. Who would you say inspires you in the energy industry? You know, it could be leader, exec, company, startup, innovator, somebody who's kind of looking to carve a path to the future. Who's on your radar?
More people than I could possibly do in a lightning round. But as a general rule, all of the people, whether they are an investor, a regulator, a planner, a founder, who look at today and ask in a constructive way, like, how can I make this different and better?
Yeah, different and better. I love it. And finally, do you have a book you could recommend for our audience? Anything on the Nat must read list?
I do, and it has nothing to do with exactly where we are in the energy system, and there's a reason for that. So my recommendation is Dr. Fei Li's book, The Worlds I See, which is her essentially autobiography of a life in artificial intelligence. I think it gives like the clearest view of how one of the foundational people in thinking about this technology thinks about technology and about the world, and gives you a great sense of where these capabilities might go in the future for all of us, and how we make how we make sure that AI remains human. You know, it's both artificial intelligence and it's human, and it's a beautifully written book. It's very entertaining, and it gets into both fundamental stories about the foundations of the AI systems that we have today, and it's just a great read. So that would be my
Mhm.
book, Reco.
All right. I appreciate it. I'm going to add that one to
Sure.
the list. Well, Nat,
Great.
thank you so much for joining us
My
on
pleasure.
Power Perspectives today. It was wonderful to get a little nerdy with you, hear some of the interesting ideas that you have about the future, and get all of this wonderful information distilled straight from the source. We're big fans of your work at Energy Central, so I'm very, very grateful that you took the time to join me today.
Thanks, Kinsey. My pleasure.